Chapter 2 The Good People. Man's imagination, like every known power, works by fixed laws, the existence and operation of which it is possible to trace, and it works upon the same material, the external universe, the mental and moral constitution of man and his social relations. Hence, diverse as may seem at first sight the results among the cultured Europeans and the devised Hottentots, the philosophical Hindus and the red Indians of the far west, they present, on a close examination, features absolutely identical. Edwin S. Hartland, The Science of Fairy Tales, an inquiry into fairy mythology. It was an unusual day for the Food and Drug Laboratory of the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare when the Air Force requested an analysis of a piece of wheat cake that had been cooked aboard a flying saucer. The human being who had obtained the cake was Joe Simonton, a 60-year-old chicken farmer who lived alone in a small house in the vicinity of Eagle River, Wisconsin. He was given 3 cakes, ate one of them, and thought it tasted like cardboard, underquotes. The Air Force put it more scientifically. The cake was composed of hydrogenated fat, starch, buckwheat, hulls, soybean hulls, wheat bran, bacteria, and radiation readings were normal for this material. Chemical, infrared, and other destructive type tests were run on this material. The Food and Drug Laboratory of the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare concluded that the material was an ordinary pancake of terrestrial origin. Where did it come from? The reader will have to decide for himself what he chooses to believe after reading this second chapter. It begins with the Eagle River incident because this is a first-hand account given by a man of absolute sincerity. Speaking for the U.S. Air Force, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who investigated the case along with Major Robert Friend and other officers from Sawyer Air Force Base, stated, "There is no question that Mr. Simonton felt that his contact had been a real experience." The time was approximately 11 a.m. on April 18, 1961, when Joe Simonton was attracted outside by a peculiar noise similar to knobby tires on a wet pavement. Underquotes. Stepping into his yard, he faced a silvery saucer-shaped object brighter than chrome, underquotes, which appeared to be hovering close to the ground without actually touching it. The object was about 12 feet high and 30 feet in diameter. A hatch opened about 5 feet from the ground, and Simonton saw 3 men inside the machine. One of them was dressed in a black two-piece suit. The occupants were about 5 feet in height, smooth-shaven. They appeared to resemble Italians, underquotes. They had dark hair and skin and wore outfits with turtleneck tops and neat helmets. One of the men held up a jug apparently made of the same material as the saucer. His motions to Joe Simonton seemed to indicate that he needed water. Simonton took the jug, went inside the house and filled it. As he returned, he saw that one of the men inside the saucer was frying food on a flameless grill of some sort, underquotes. The interior of the ship was black, the color of wrought iron, underquotes. Simonton, who could see several instrument panels, heard a slow whining sound similar to the hum of a generator. When he made a motion indicating he was interested in the food that was being prepared, one of them, who was also dressed in black, but with a narrow red trim along the trousers, handed him 3 cookies, about 3 inches in diameter and perforated with small holes. The whole affair had lasted about 5 minutes. Finally, the man closest to the witness attached a kind of belt to a hook in his clothing and closed the hatch in such a way that Simonton could scarcely detect its outline. Then the object rose about 20 feet from the ground before taking off straight south, causing a blast of air that bore some nearby pine trees. Along the edge of the saucer, the witness recalls, were exhaust pipes 6 or 7 inches in diameter. The hatch was about 6 feet high and 30 inches wide, and although the object has always been described as a saucer, its shape was that of 2 inverted bowls. When 2 deputies sent by Sheriff Schroeder, who had known Simonton for 14 years, arrived on the scene, they could not find any corroborative evidence. The sheriff affirmed that the witness obviously believed the truth of what he was saying and talked very sensibly about the incident. Food from Fairyland. The Eagle River case has never been solved. The Air Force believes that Joe Simonton, who lived alone, had a sudden dream while he was awake and inserted his dream into the continuum of events around him of which he was conscious. I understand several psychologists in Dayton, Ohio are quite satisfied with this explanation, and so are most serious amateur ufologists. Alas, ufology, like psychology, has become such a narrow field of specialization that the experts have no time left for general culture. They are so busy rationalizing the dreams of other people that they themselves do not dream anymore, nor do they read fairy tales. If they did, they would perhaps take a much closer look at Joe Simonton and his pancakes. They would know about the gentry and the food from the fairyland. In 1909, an American, Wens, who wrote a thesis on Celtic traditions in Brittany, devoted much time to the gathering of folk tales about supernatural beings, their habits, their contacts with men, and their food. In his book, he gives the story of Pat Fickney, an Irishman of whom we know only that he was well off before the hard times, meaning perhaps the famine of 1846 to 1847. One day, a little woman came to his house and asked for some oatmeal. Paddy had so little that he was ashamed to offer it, so he offered her some potatoes instead. But she wanted oatmeal, and then he gave her all that he had. She told him to place it back in the bin till she should return for it. This he did, and the next morning the bin was overflowing with oatmeal. The woman was one of the gentry. It is unfortunate that Paddy did not save this valuable evidence for the benefit of the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare, Food and Drug Labs. Perhaps they would have explained this miracle of the multiplication of the oatmeal along with other peculiar properties of the fairy food. For it is well known in Ireland that if you are taken away by the fairies, you must never taste food in their palace. Otherwise you never come back. You become one of them. It is interesting that the analysis performed for the Air Force did not mention the presence of salt in the pancakes given to Simonton. Indeed, Waynes was told by an Irishman who was quite familiar with the gentry that they never taste anything salt, but eat fresh meat and drink pure water. Pure water is what the saucerman took from Simonton. The question of food is one of the points most frequently treated in the traditional literature of Celtic legends, along with the documented stories of babies kidnapped by the elves and of the terrestrial animals they hunt and take away. Before we study this abundant material, however, we should supply some background information about the mysterious folks the Irish call the gentry and the Scots, the good people, Sleg Maith. The gentry are a fine large race who live out on the sea and in the mountains, and they are all very good neighbors. The bad ones are not the gentry at all, are the fallen angels, and they live in the woods and the sea, says one of Wayne's informers. Patrick Water gives this description of the fairy man undergoes. A crowd of boys out in the fields one day saw a fairy man with a red cap. Except for his height, he was like any other man. He was about 3.5 feet tall. The boys surrounded him, but he made such a sputtering talk they let him go, and he disappeared as he walked away in the direction of the old fort. There were few places where one could still see fairies, even in Great Britain or France after 1850. All the storytellers, all the popular almanacs agree that as civilization advanced, the little folks became increasingly shy. A few untouched places recommended by Wentz, however, are the Yosemite Valley in California and the Ben Bulben County and Ross Point in County Sligo, Ireland. Dublin seers are known to have made many trips to Ben Bulben, a famous mountain honeycombed with curious grottos. At the very foot of the mountain, as the heavy white fog banks hung over the Ben Bulben and its neighbors, Waynes was told the following incident occurred. When I was a young man, I often used to go out in the mountains over there to fish for trout or to hunt, and it was in January on a cold, dry day while carrying my gun that I and a friend with me as we were walking around Ben Bulben saw one of the gentry for the first time. This one was dressed in blue with a headdress adorned with what seemed to be frills. When he came upon us, he said to me in a sweet and silvery voice, "The seldom you come to this mountain, the better, mister. A young lady here wants to take you away." Then he told us not to fire our guns, because the gentry disliked being disturbed by the noise, and he seemed to be like a soldier of the gentry on guard. As we were leaving the mountain, he told us not to look back, and we didn't. Wentz then asked for a description of the gentry, and he was told the following. "The folk are the grandest I have ever seen. They are far superior to us, and that is why they call themselves the gentry. They are not a working class, but a military aristocratic class, tall and noble appearing. They are a distinct race between our race and that of spirits, as they have told me. Their qualifications are tremendous. We could cut off half the human race, but would not, they said, for we are expecting salvation. And I knew a man 3 or 4 years ago whom they struck down with paralysis. Their sight is so penetrating that I think they could see through the earth. They have a silvery voice, quick and sweet. The Gentry live inside the mountains in beautiful castles, and there are a good many branches of them in other countries, and especially in Ireland. Some live in the Wicklow Mountains near Dublin. Like armies, they have their stations and move from one to another. My guide and informer said to me once, I command a regiment, mister. They travel greatly, and they can appear in Paris, Marseille, Naples, Genoa, Turin, or Dublin, like ordinary people, and even in crowds. They love especially Spain, southern France, and the south of Europe. The gentry take a great interest in the affairs of men, and they always stand for justice and right. Sometimes they fight among themselves. They take young and intelligent people who are interesting. They take the whole body and soul, transmuting the body to a body like their own. I asked them once if they ever died, and they said no. We are always kept young, mister. Once they take you and you taste food in the palace, you cannot come back. They never taste anything salt, but eat fresh meat and drink pure water. They marry and have children, and one of them could marry a good and pure mortal. They are able to appear in different forms. One once appeared to me and seemed only 4 feet high and stoutly built. He said, I am bigger than I appear to you now. We can make the old young, the big small, and the small big. Now that we have refreshed the reader's memory regarding the gentry, perhaps we shall be forgiven but for driving the parallel between fairy faith and the ufology a good deal further. The Eagle River incident, again, will be the occasion for our reflections. The cakes given to Joe Simonton were composed of, among other things, buckwheat hulls. And buckwheat is closely associated with the legends of Brittany, one of the most conservative Celtic areas. In that area of France, belief in fairies is still widespread, although Wens and Paul Seuvilot had great difficulty, about 1900, finding Bretons who said that they themselves had seen fairies. One of the peculiarities of Breton traditional legends is the association of the fairies or Coringans with a race of beings named Fions. In our chapter on the Secret Commonwealth, we shall study the Fions more closely. Here I want only to call the reader's attention to one particularly pretty legend of our Fions and magic buckwheat cakes. It seems that once upon a time a black cow belonging to a little cave-dwelling Fions ruined the buckwheat field of a poor woman who bitterly complained about the damage. The Fions made a deal with her. They would see to it that she should never run out of buckwheat cakes, provided she kept her mouth shut. And indeed, she and her family discovered that their supply of cakes was inexhaustible. Alas, one day the woman gave some of the cake to a man who should not have been entrusted with the secret of its magical origin, and the family had to go back to the ordinary way of making buckwheat cakes. I hardly need remind the reader that the Bible, too, gives a few examples of magical food supplies, similarly inexhaustible. Moreover, stories narrated by actual people provide close parallels to this theme. Witness the following account given by Heartland. A man who lived at Strathlannis in Brecknockshire, going one day to look after his cattle and sheep on the mountain, disappeared. In about 3 weeks, after search had been made in vain for him and his wife had given him up for dead, he came home. His wife asked him where he had been for the last 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Is it 3 weeks you call 3 hours? Said he. Pressed to say where he had been, he told her he had been playing his flute, which he usually took with him on the mountain. At the Lorfa, a spot near the Van Pool, when he was surrounded at a distance by little beings like men, who closed nearer and nearer to him until they became a very small circle. They sang and danced and so affected him that he quite lost himself. They offered him some small cakes to eat, of which he partook, and he had never enjoyed himself so well in his life. Wens, too, has a few stories about the food from fairyland. He gathered them during his trips through the Celtic countries in the first few years of the present century. John McNeill of Barra, an old man who spoke no English, told Michael Buchanan, who translated the story from the Gaelic for Wens, a pretty tale about a girl who was taken by the fairies. The fairies, he said, took the girl into their dwelling and set her to work baking oat cakes. But no matter how much meal she took from the closet, there was always the same amount left on the shelf, and she had to keep baking and baking until the old ferryman took pity on her and said, I am sure you are wearing off the time and thinking long of getting from our premises, and I will direct you to the means by which you can get your leave. Whatever remainder of meal falls from the cakes after being baked, put into the meal closet, and that will stimulate my wife to give you leave. Naturally, she did as directed and got away. John McNeill, who was between 70 and 80 years old, gave no date to the story, but since he said he saw the girl after her experience, the event probably took place on the second part of the 19th century. Scientifically inclined people scoff at such stories with a very indignant air. A group of UFO students, when contacted about the Eagle River incident, stated that they did not intend to analyze the cookies, planned no further action, and had much more important things to investigate. 2 weeks after the sighting, Joe Simonton told a United Press International reporter that if it happened again, I don't think I'd tell anybody about it. And indeed, if flying saucers were devices used by a super scientific civilization from space, we would expect them to be packed inside with electronic gadgetry, super radars, and a big computerized spying apparatus. But visitors in human shape, who breathe our air and zip around in flying kitchenettes, that is too much, Mr. Simonton. Visitors from the stars would not be human or humanoid. They would not dare come here without receiving a polite invitation from our powerful radio telescopes. For centuries, we would exchange highly scientific information through exquisite circuitry and elaborate codes. And even if they did come here, surely they would land in Washington, D.C., where the President of the United States and the scientific ufologists, on the course, would greet them. Presents would be exchanged. We would offer books on exobiology. They would give us photographs of our solar system taken through a space telescope. But perforated cardboard tasting pancake-shaped buckwheat cakes? How terribly ruler, Mr. Simonton. And yet, there is no question that Joe Simonton believes that he saw the flying saucer, the flameless grill, the three men. He gave them pure water. They gave him 3 pancakes. If we reflect on this very simple event, as the students of folklore have reflected on the stories quoted above, we cannot overlook one possibility, that the event at Eagle River did happen, and that it has meaning of a simple yet grandiose ceremony. This latter theory was very well expressed by Hartland when he said about the exchange of food with fairies. Almost all over the earth, the right of hospitality has been held to confer obligations on its recipient and to unite him by special ties to the giver. And even where the notion of hospitality does not enter, to join in a common meal has often been held to symbolize, if not to constitute, union of a very sacred kind. That such meaning is still attached to a common meal is readily seen at weddings and other traditional meetings where food is an important constituent, even if the symbolic value of such events is lost to most of our contemporaries. Hartland goes as far as to suggest that the custom of burying the dead with some food might bear some relationship to the widespread belief that one must have supply of terrestrial food when one reaches fairyland or forsake the earth entirely. And indeed, in ancient and recent tradition alike, the abode of our supernatural visitors is not always distinct from the world of the dead. This is a moot point, however, because the same applies to visitors on the course from heaven. The theologians who argue about the nature of angels know it very well, but at least the idea of food provides another connection. In the light of Hartland's remarks about the right of hospitality, a passage from the Bible is noteworthy. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourself under the tree, and I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hurts. After that ye shall pass on. For therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, So do, as thou hast said. And he took butter and milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did it. And according to Genesis 19:3, Lord took the 2 angels he made at the gate of Sodom to his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. Undergoes. So after all, Joe Simonton's account might be a modern illustration of that biblical recommendation. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Rings in the moonlight. This section is devoted to several types of artifacts claimed by popular tradition to be of supernatural origin. Fairy rings undercoats and saucer nests undercoats obviously fall in this category. Although such phenomena are treated as borderline cases by specialists in the UFO investigation, I believe the nests deserve more than passing attention and should be considered in the light of specific traditional beliefs about the meaning of the magic circles undercoats that for centuries farmers have found in their fields. The literature on this subject is of course abundant, and we shall select only a few cases to illustrate the point and set the stage for a more detailed discussion in the later chapters. On Thursday, July 28, 1966, in the evening, Mr. Lacoste and his wife were walking in the vicinity of Montserrat, Maine-et-Loire, France. All of a sudden, they saw a red sphere across the sky like a meteor. It did not behave quite as a meteor, however, because it seemed to touch the ground and then rise again, without losing its brilliant red color, and hover at mid-height for a while before it was lost to sight. A check was made for military experiments in the area. There were none. The next day, a Montserrat farmer, Alain Roulet, reported that a 9 square yard area of wheat field had been flattened and covered with a yellowish oily substance. Further investigation disclosed additional details on the identity of the witnesses and substantiated the idea that a peculiar object had indeed landed. Lacoste is a photographer in Saumur. Unfortunately, he did not carry a camera with him at the time. He described the light given off by the sphere as being so intense that it lit up the whole countryside. The sphere hovered, he said, for a few seconds, then it maneuvered close to the ground. The witnesses felt sure it was a guided military gadget and walked to a distance of about 400 yards from the object, which went away and was lost to sight behind some woods. The whole sighting had lasted for 4 minutes. 6 months later, a rash of similar sightings had made headlines in Australia. More flying saucer nests was the big news on the front page of the Sydney Sun Herald for January 23, 1966. 3 nests have been discovered in Queensland, circular clearings of dead reeds surrounded by green reeds. Hundreds of sightseers were searching for more by the time the reports were published. On January 19, 1966, at 9 a.m., a 27-year-old banana grower, George Padley, was driving his tractor in the vicinity of a swamp called Horseshoe Lagoon when he suddenly heard a loud hissing noise. It sounded like air escaping from a tire, undercourse, he said. Then 25 yards in front of him, he saw a machine rising from the swamp. It was blue-gray, about 25 feet across and 9 feet high. It was spinning and rose to about 60 feet before moving off. It was all over in a few seconds. It moved at terrific speed, said Padley. Then he found the first nest, with reeds flattened in a clockwise direction. The Sydney Sun Herald sent a reporter, Wayne Davey, to investigate the sighting, and it was discovered that dozens of people in the area had seen strange saucer-like craft similar to the one reported by Padley, most of them before his sighting. Davey found a total of 5 nests and published the following description. I saw clearings in the reeds where they took off, and it was as everyone described it. In a circle roughly 30 feet in diameter, reeds had been cut and flattened in a clockwise direction. One of the nests in a floating platform of clotted roots and weeds, apparently torn by tremendous force from the mud bottom beneath the 5 feet of water. The second and third nests had been found respectively by Tom Warren, a cane farmer of Uramo, and Mr. Penning, a Tully school teacher. They were about 25 yards from the first one, but hidden by dense scrub. In the third nest, which seemed quite recent, the reeds were flattened in a counterclockwise direction. All the reeds were dead, but they had not been scorched or burned. A patch of cow's grass, about 4 feet square and 3 feet from the boundary of the first disc, had been clipped at water level, thereby adding a new element of mystery. Altogether, the rings varied in diameter from 8 to 30 feet. In all but the smallest, the reeds had been flattened in a clockwise direction. Needless to say, the policemen collected samples for tests, scientists came in Geiger counters, and the Royal Australian Air Force intelligence people were all over the place. Rumors circulated blaming the Soviets for using the vast open spaces of Australia to develop scientific ideas 1 or 2 centuries ahead of those of the Americans. Why the Soviets could not conduct their secret testing in the vast open spaces of Siberia was not disclosed. Neither was it revealed why the pilots of the super-secret communist weapon could not resist the temptation to buzz the tractor of a 27-year-old banana grower. Fortunately, there were several natural explanations for the sighting or the nest, although only one hypothesis accounted for both. The latter was suggested by a Sydney Sun Herald reader on January 30. He believed the outer space undergoes panic in Queensland was caused by a tall, shy bird with a blue body and red markings on the head undergoes. It was either a type of brolga or a blue heron, but the man did not know the correct scientific name. Many times, as he wandered barefooted through the bush, he said he had seen the birds dancing, but they flew away at high speed before he could reach them. They would resemble a vaporous blue cloud and would certainly make a whirring sound in flight. Unfortunately for this pretty and imaginative theory, it got no backing from the Australian museum ornithologist H.J. Disney thought the Brolgas could not make circular depressions of symmetrical design. He was similarly skeptical about the bald-headed coot theory undergoes advanced by another man, Gulugog resident Ken Adam. I've never heard of this habit by the bird, Disney said. Donald Hanlon, one of the best informed specialists in the field, has pointed out to me that another explanation for the nests has been proposed locally. They are the playground of crocodiles in love, undergoes. I fully share Hanlon's skepticism about this last explanation, but it could hardly apply to the nests found in Ohio, which will be discussed in a moment, or to the damaged wheat field in Montserrat. A Queensland resident, Alex Borduzenko, who knows about the crocodiles, claims that the reeds are too thick in Horseshoe Lagoon for crocodiles to move through them. So here we are. Dancing cranes are held responsible by some people for bending reeds that are so thick crocodiles, according to the other people, cannot move through them. What caused the damage? Nobody knows. On his way home that Wednesday night, George Pedley decided that he would tell no one about the spaceship undercoats in the swamp. He saw neither portholes nor antenna on the blue-gray object, and no sign of life either side or about it. Furthermore, he had always laughed at flying saucer stories. But then he met Albert Panesi, the owner of the Horseshoe Lagoon, and disclosed the sighting. He was very surprised when Panesi believed him right away and told him he had been dreaming for a week that a flying saucer would land on his property. This last detail places the Queensland saucer nest in the best tradition of the fairy faith. The time, 6 months before the Queensland experience, the place, Delray, Ohio. On January 28, 1965, a farmer, John Stefano, heard a series of explosions. 2 days later, he discovered a curious formation on the ground. When analyzed, soil and wheat samples showed no evidence of explosive cause. Wheat plants seemed to have been sucked out of the ground, like the uprooted reeds in Queensland or the uprooted grass in the French landing of 1944 in Ponce. The Ohio incident was carefully investigated by A. Canduso and Larry Moyers of the Flying Saucer Investigating Committee, accompanied by Gary Davis. They found the strange circular formation on Stevano's farm, which is situated on a high point. At the center of the ring was a circular depression about 28 inches in diameter. It was probed with a pinch bar, but only loose soil was found for a depth of 9 inches. Most of the wheat had been removed, roots and all, and clods of soil a few inches long had been disturbed. The wheat was laid down like the spokes of a wheel. There was no swirling effect as in the Tully nests. As if we turn from Australia and Ohio to England, we are faced with another incident. July 16, 1963, will long be remembered in the annals of British ufology. Something appeared to have landed on farmer Roy Blanchard's field at the manor farm, Charlton, Wiltshire. The marks on the ground were first discovered by a farm worker, Rez Alexander. They overlapped a potato field and a barley field. The marks comprised a saucer-shaped depression or crater 8 feet in diameter and about 4 inches in depth. In the center of this depression, there was found a 3 feet deep hole variously described as from 5 inches to 1 foot in diameter. Radiating from the central hole were 4 slot marks, 4 feet long and 1 foot wide. The object must have landed, if land it did, unseen. But Mr. Leonard Jolliffe, a dairyman on the farm, reported he heard a blast one morning at approximately 6 a.m. On July 23, the London Daily Express was to report that nearly 2 weeks earlier, on July 10, Police Constable Anthony Penny had seen an orange object flash through the sky and vanish near the manor farm field. On the basis of this limited information, it would seem quite plausible to think that the Charlton crater was caused by a meteorite. Indeed, when a small piece of metal was removed from the hole at the center of the crater, British astronomer Patrick Moore went to the British Broadcasting Corporation and stated categorically that the crater had been caused by a shrimp-sized meteorite, undergoes, crashing down and turning itself into a very effective explosive. This ended the mystery as far as the scientific public was concerned. But the true facts of the matter, as they became known to a few scientists who pursued the matter further, and to the army engineers who were in charge of the investigation, were altogether different. Farmer Roy Blanchard had sent for the police, who in turn had summoned the army. Captain John Rogers, chief of the Army Bomb Disposal Unit, was the man who conducted most of the field investigations. His preliminary report indicated that there were no burn or scratch marks, no trace of an explosion, and while Captain Rogers stated that he and his superiors were baffled, Farmer Roy Blanchard made further disclosures. There isn't a trace of the potatoes and barley which were growing where the crater is now. No stalks, no roots, no leaves. The thing was heavy enough to crush rocks and stones to powder. Yet it came down gently. We heard no crash, and whatever power it uses produces no heat or noise. Then on July 19, it was reported that Captain Rogers had obtained permission to sink a shaft. The readings obtained were rather unusual. They indicated a metallic object of some size deeply embedded, and it was further learned that detectors behaved wildly, and of course, presumably because the metallic piece in question was highly magnetic. At this stage, it should be pointed out that the investigation was still open and above board, possibly because the Army, rather than the British Air Ministry, was involved. And the Army's Southern Command Public Relations Officer at Salisbury told Girvan that the object was recovered from the hole. It was sent to a British museum expert and promptly identified as a piece of common ironstone, which could be found buried all over southern England. The British Museum suggested that it had been buried in the ground for some time, thus eliminating the idea of a hoax. And Dr. F. Claringbull, keeper of the Department of Mineralogy at the museum, destroyed the meteorite explanation and, according to the Yorkshire Post of July 27, stated, "There is more in this farm than meets the eye." The last word stayed with Southern Command, however, and it commented wisely. "The cause of the phenomena is still unexplained, but it is no part the Army's task to unravel such mysteries." If we try to summarize what we have learned from these incidents, the Tully Nest, the Ohio Ring, and the Charlton Crater, we can state the following. Number 1. Public rumor associates sightings of flying saucers with the discovery of circular depressions on the ground. Number 2. When vegetation is present at the site, it exhibits the action of a flattening force which produces either a stationary pattern, spokes of a wheel, or a rotating pattern, clockwise or anti-clockwise. Number 3. Some of the vegetation is usually removed and sometimes with the roots, leaves, etc. Number 4. The effect of a very strong force is often noticed, as evidenced by earth and plants scattered around the site. Number 5. Strong magnetic activity has been found in one instance where common ironstone was buried close to the center of the depression. And number 6. A deep hole, a few inches in diameter, is often present at the center. Do I need to remind the reader of that celebrated habit of the fairies to leave behind them strange rings in the fields and prairies? One Sunday in August, as he wandered over the hills of Howth, Waynes met some local people with whom he discussed these old tales. After he had had tea with the man and his daughter, they took him to a field close by to show him a fairy ring, and of course, and while he stood in the ring, they told him, "Yes, the fairies do exist, and this is where they have often been seen dancing. The grass never gets high in the lines of the ring, for it is only the shortest and finest kind that grows there. In the middle, fairy mushrooms grow in a circle, and the fairies use them to sit on. They are very little people and very fond of dancing and singing. They wear green coats and sometimes red caps and red coats." On November 12, 1968, the Argentine press reported that near Necochea, 310 miles south of Buenos Aires, a civilian pilot had reported a strange pattern on the ground and investigated it with several military men. Walking to the spot where a flying saucer was earlier alleged to have landed, they found a circle 6 yards in diameter where the earth was calcined. Inside the circle grew 8 giant white mushrooms, one of them nearly 3 feet in diameter. In Santa Fe province, other extraordinary mushrooms have been discovered under similar circumstances. Another writer, reporting on Scandinavian legends, noted that elves are depicted there as beings with oversized heads, tiny legs, and long arms. They are responsible for the bright green circles, called elf dance, that one sees on the lawns. Even nowadays, when a Danish farmer comes across such a ring at dawn, he says that elves have come there during the night to dance. It is amusing to note that attempts have been made in early days of rationalism to explain fairy rings as electrical phenomena, a consequence of atmospheric effects. P. Marangino, for example, quotes a little couplet by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of the English naturalist, written in 1789. So from the dark clouds the playful lightning springs, rives the firm oak, and prints the fairy rings. And according to Erasmus Darwin, there is a phenomenon supposed to be electric which is not yet accounted for. I mean the fairy rings, as they are called, so often seen on the grass. At times, larger parts or prominences of clouds gradually sinking as they move along are discharged on the moister parts of the grassy plains. Now this knob or corner of a cloud, in being attracted to the earth, will become nearly cylindrical, as loose wool would do when drawn out into a thread, and will strike the earth with a stream of electricity perhaps 2 or 10 yards in diameter. Just the external part of the cylinder burns the grass. The formulation of this idea in terms of modern plasma physics will no doubt soon be provided by eager scholars. They would do well, however, to note the diameter of the cylinder mentioned by the elder Darwin, 2 or 10 yards, the diameter of the average flying saucer. Angels or devils? We have already noted several instances connecting unknown beings with the theft of agricultural products. Lavender plants, grapes, or potatoes seem to have been taken away with equal dexterity by the mysterious little men. In story after story from North and South America and from Europe, the creatures are seen alighting from their shiny craft, picking up plants and taking off again before amazed witnesses. Such behavior is well designed to make the investigators of such stories assume that the visitors are gathering samples with all the care and precision of seasoned exobiologists. Are we not, after all, designing robots that will accomplish the preliminary analysis of the Martian flora when the first rockets reach that planet? In a few cases, the visitors even take the time to interview the witnesses at length concerning agricultural techniques. Such was the case in a landing that, curiously enough, took place in Tioga City, New York, on the very day of the Socorro landing, about 10 hours before the officer Zamora observed the egg-shaped, shiny object so familiar to us now. Gary T. Wilcox, a dairy farmer, was spreading fertilizer in his field. Sometime before 10 a.m., he stopped to check a field surrounded by woods. About a mile away from his barn, he wanted to see whether ground conditions would allow plowing. As he approached the field, however, he saw a shiny object which he first took to be a discarded refrigerator, then a wing tank or some other aircraft part. When he drew closer, he realized that the object was egg-shaped and about 20 by 16 feet, had the appearance of durable metal, and did not look like anything he had ever seen before. He touched it. It was not hot. He observed no door or hatch of any kind, and yet 2 human-like creatures suddenly appeared. They were about 4 feet tall and wore seamless clothing and headdress and a full-face hood, which did not allow Wilcox to observe any facial features. They appeared to have arms and legs. They talked to him in smooth English, of course, but their voices did not come from their heads, as far as Wilcox could tell, but from their bodies. "Do not be alarmed. We have talked to people before. We are from what you people refer to as planet Mars," they said. In spite of Gary's conviction that someone must be playing a gag on me, of course, the strange conversation continued. The 2 beings were interested in fertilizers and expressed considerable interest in their use. They stated that they grew food on Mars, but that changes in the environment were creating problems they hoped to solve by obtaining information about our agricultural techniques. Their questions were quite childish, and they appeared to have no knowledge of the subject whatever. Each one carried a tray filled with soil. "When they talked about space or the ship, I had difficulty in understanding their explanations. They said they could only travel to this planet every 2 years, and they are presently using the Western Hemisphere," Wilcox reported. They explained that they landed only during daylight hours, because their ship is less readily visible in daylight. And they said they were surprised that Wilcox had seen their craft. They also volunteered information about space travel. "Our astronauts would not be successful," they said, "because their bodies would not adapt to space conditions. Finally, they requested a bag of fertilizer, but as Gary Wilcox walked away to get it, the craft took off, disappearing from sight in very few seconds. The witness left a bag of fertilizer at the place. The next day, it was gone. A list, even incomplete, of similar cases would rapidly induce tedium. In most of the South American landings, entities have been described walking away with soil samples, plants, even boulders. Everything in their behavior seems designed to make us believe in the outer space origin of these strange beings and their craft. And indeed, such incidents have greatly influenced the researchers who have independently, concluded that UFOs are space probes sent by extraterrestrial civilization. On November 1, 1954, Mrs. Rosa Lotti Dainelli, 40 years old, was going to the cemetery at Poggio de Ambra Bricini, near Arezzo, Italy. A devout Italian woman, she was carrying a pot containing flowers. Her mind at that moment must have been very far indeed from science fiction speculation, and yet what happened to her in the next minute constitutes perhaps the strangest of the entire wave of 1954 incidents. As Mrs. Lotti Danieli walked past an open grassy space, she saw a vertical torpedo-shaped machine with pointed edges. A machine, in other words, shaped like two cones with common bases. In the lower cone was an opening through which two small seats were visible. The craft looked metallic. It did not resemble anything the witness had seen before. From behind the object, two beings appeared. They were 3.5 to 4 feet tall. They looked joyful. Their smiles displayed white and very tiny teeth. They were wearing grey coveralls and reddish leather helmets, similar to those used by military drivers. They had what seemed to be a convexity at the center of their foreheads. Speaking an incomprehensible language, the two closed in on the woman, and one of them took away from her the pot containing the flowers. Mrs. Lotti Dainelli now tried to get her property back, but the two beings ignored her and returned to their craft. The witness started to scream and run away, but she returned to the spot with other witnesses, including policemen. Too late. Not a trace of the object was left, but it seems that other people saw the craft in flight, leaving a red and blue trail. These stories would be amazing, and nothing more of it, if it were not for one fact known to students of folklore. A constant feature of one class of legends involving supernatural creatures is that the beings come to our world to steal our products, our animals, and even, as we shall see in the later chapter, human beings. But for the moment, let us concern ourselves only with the sample gathering behavior of these beings and their requests for terrestrial products. In an Algonquin legend embodying all of the characteristics of an excellent sorcery story, a hunter beholds a basket that comes down from heaven. The basket contains 12 young maidens of ravishing beauty. The man attempts to approach them, but the celestial creatures quickly re-enter the basket which ascends rapidly out of sight. However, witnessing the descent of the strange object on another day, the same hunter uses a trick to come close to it and succeeds in capturing one of the girls, whom he marries and by whom he has a son. Nothing, unfortunately, can console his wife for loss of the society of her sisters, who have gone away with the flying vehicle. So one day she makes a small basket, and according to Heartland, having entered it with her child, she sang the charm she and her sisters had formerly used, and ascended once more to the star from whence she had come. She had been back in that heavenly country 2 years when she was told, "Thy son wants to see his father. Go down, therefore, to the earth, and fetch thy husband, and tell him to bring us specimens of all the animals he kills." She did so, and the hunter ascended with his wife, saw his son, and attended to great feast, at which the animals he had brought were served. The Algonquin story offers a complex mixture of themes. Some of them are present in modern-day UFO stories. Others derive from traditional concepts, such as the exchange of food, which have already been discussed. The new elements are, number 1, the desire expressed by the celestial beings to receive specimens of all the animals the hunter kills, and number 2, the idea that the intermarriage between the terrestrial and the aerial races is possible. The latter aspect will be examined separately in Chapter 4. So far, we have seen our visitors stealing plants and requesting various items, but have they actually killed animals themselves? Have they taken away cattle? If we are to believe the stories told by many witnesses, they have. But the interesting fact is that, here again, we find a trait common to both the UFO nuts and the good people. On page 53, I shall have the occasion to quote, in another context, a story describing a crowd of fairies chasing a deer on the island of Aramor. The storyteller added that, at another time, similarly the people chased a horse, and in the same conversation with Walter Wenz, recorded before 1909, the storyteller, Old Patsy, told the following story about a man who, if he's still alive, is now in America where he went several years ago. In the South Island, as night was coming on, a man was giving his cow water at a well, and as he looked on the other side of the wall, he saw many strange people playing hurley. When they noticed him looking at them, one came up and struck the cow a hard blow, and turning on the man, caught his face and body very badly. The man might not have been so badly off, but he returned to the well after the first encounter and got 4 times as bad a beating. On November 6, 1957, 12-year-old Everett Clark of Dante, Tennessee, opened the door to let his dog Frisky out. As he did so, he saw a peculiar object in a field 100 yards or so from the house. He thought he was dreaming and went back inside. When he called the dog 20 minutes later, he found the object was still there and Frisky was standing near it, along with several dogs from the neighborhood. Also near the object were 2 men and 2 women in ordinary clothing. One of the men made several attempts to catch Frisky and later another dog, but had to give up for fear of being bitten. Everett saw the strange people who talked between them, like German soldiers he had seen in movies, walk right into the wall of the object, which then took off straight up without sound. It was oblong and of no particular color. In another of the extraordinary coincidences with which UFO researchers are now becoming familiar, on the same day, another attempt to steal a dog was made, this time in Everettstown, New Jersey. While the Clark case had taken place at 6:30 a.m., it was at dusk that John Trasco went outside to feed his dog and saw a brilliant egg-shaped object hovering in front of his barn. In his path, he found a being 3 feet tall, with putty-colored face and large frog-like eyes, who said in broken English, "We are peaceful people. We only want your dog." The strange being was told in no uncertain terms to go back where he belonged. He ran away and his machine was seen to take off straight up some moments later. Mrs. Trasco is said to have observed the object itself from the house, but not the entity. She is also quoted as saying that when her husband tried to grab the creature, he got some green powder on his wrist, but that it washed off. The next day he noticed the same powder under his fingernails. The UFO nut had been dressed in a green suit with shiny buttons, a green tam o' shanter-like cap, and gloves with a shiny object at the tip of each, according to Coral Lorenzen. We have already explored several aspects of the behavior attributed, in modern and ancient folklore, to supernatural beings. Whether the creatures come down in flying saucers or musical baskets, whether they come out of the sea or the rock, is irrelevant. What is relevant is what they say and do, the trace that they leave in the human witness who is the only tangible vehicle of the story. This behavior presents us with a sample of situations and human reactions that trigger our interest, our concern, our laughter. Joe Simonton's pancake story is cute. The tales of fairy food are intriguing but difficult to trace. The rings and the nests are real, but the feeling they inspire is more romantic than scientific. Then there is the strange being's peculiarly insistent desire to get hold of terrestrial objects, flora and fauna. The stories quoted in this connection verge on the ludicrous, but to pursue the investigation further leads to horror. This is a facet of the phenomenon we can no longer ignore. The Haunted Land. If human reactions to the vision of a UFO are varied, the opposite holds true for animals. Their reaction is unmistakably one of terror. To the well-known question that figures in almost every UFO questionnaire, "How was your attention called to the object?" one frequently finds the answer, "My dog seemed terrified. There was a commotion among the cattle. All the dogs in the neighborhood started acting madly." Enough material already exists in documented cases of animal reaction to close exposure to a UFO for an outstanding dissertation on animal psychology. On December 30, 1966, an animal nuclear physicist was driving south with his family along a Louisiana road. The weather was overcast and it was raining. The time was 8:15 p.m. The witness, who is a professor of physics and does nuclear research, and who as a result is a very well qualified witness, had reached a point north of Hennesville when he noticed a pulsating dome of light resembling the glow of a city. Its color went from a dim reddish light to a bright orange. At one point, its luminosity rose so much that it became brighter than the car headlights. So intense was the white illumination that the 2 children who were sleeping in the back woke up and, with the physicist's wife, observed what followed. The light was emitted by a source that was stationary and below the treetops, at or close to ground level, some distance into the forest. Concern for his family's safety made the witness drive away, but he did make a quick estimate of the amount of energy represented by the light, and it turned out to be a fairly impressive source of radiation. Impressive enough to make him return to the location next day, bearing a scintillometer with him. He determined the probable position of the object, which had been about 1 mile, plus or minus 0.2 mile, from his car at the closest point. Then he made some inquiries in the area. The investigations had two results. First, while walking in the forest, he noticed that for some distance around the spot where the source of light had been, animal life had simply vanished. There were no squirrels, no birds, even no insects. And as a hunter, he was quite familiar with the Louisiana fauna. Second, he gathered several reports by local people who had seen the light and claims by farmers that important loss of cattle had occurred in the same period. Until I heard this physicist's testimony, I had never given much credence to reports of stolen cattle. Cows and horses did run away sometimes or were stolen, and the likelihood that a farmer would try to place the blame on some supernatural agency remains very high even in the 20th century. There is, however, a precedent which cannot be ignored. The Leroy, Kansas case where a cow was stolen by a pilot of a flying object. If that report were dated from 1966, perhaps it could be ignored, but it was recorded and shown before witnesses on April 21, 1897, by one of the most prominent citizens in Kansas, Alexander Hamilton. In an affidavit quoted in several recent UFO books and journals, Hamilton states that he was awakened by a noise among the cattle and went out with 2 other men. He then saw an airship descend gently toward the ground and hover within 50 yards of it. It consisted of a great cigar-shaped portion, possibly 300 feet long, with a carriage underneath. The carriage was made of glass and some other transparent substance, alternating with a narrow strip of some material. It was brilliantly lighted within, and everything was plainly visible. It was occupied by 6 of the strangest beings I ever saw. They were jabbering together, but we could not understand a word they said. Upon seeing the witnesses, the pilots of the strange ship turned on some unknown power, and the ship rose about 300 feet above them. It seemed to pause and hover directly over a 2-year-old heifer, which was bawling and jumping, apparently fast in the fence. Going to her, we found a cable about ½ inch in thickness, made of some red material, fastened in a slip knot around her neck, one end passing up to the vessel, and the heifer tangled in the wire fence. We tried to get it off but could not, so we cut the wire loose and stood in amazement to see the ship, heifer and all, rise slowly, disappearing in the northwest. Hamilton was so frightened he could not sleep that night. Rising early Tuesday, I started out by horse, hoping to find some trace of my cow. This I failed to do, but coming back in the evening, I found that Link Thomas, about 3 or 4 miles west of Leroy, had found the hide, legs, and the head in the field that day. He, thinking someone had butchered a stolen beast, had brought the hide to town for identification, but was gently mystified in not being able to find any tracks in the soft ground. After identifying the hide by my brand, I went home, but every time I would drop to sleep, I would see the cursed thing, with its big lights and hideous people. I don't know whether they are devils or angels or what, but we all saw them, and my whole family saw the ship, and I don't want any more to do with them. One more case and the circle will be closed, and it will serve to take a case that has been widely reported and discussed among UFO students, though it has passed practically unnoticed in the national press. A horse named Snippy, missing for 2 days, was found on September 15, 1967, 6 miles from the main highway near the Grand Sand Dunes National Monument in Colorado. No flesh remained on the head, neck, and shoulders. The hide was peeled back to expose the skull, and the vital organs were gone, according to Snippy's owner, Mr. Burley Lewis, and her brother, Harry King. When they went to the site, they also observed what seemed to be 15 circular exhaust marks covering an area about 100 by 50 yards. A chico bush had been flattened, and close to it there were 6 identical holes, 2 inches wide and 4 inches deep. As the horse lay about a quarter of a mile from a cabin owned by an 87-year-old lady, Mrs. Lewis and King went to interview her, and she said she had seen a large object pass over her home at rooftop level on the day Snippy was last seen. She added that, without her glasses, she had been unable to determine what the object was. Alamosa County Sheriff Ben Phillips declined to visit the site, stating the horse must have been killed by lightning. A pathologist who did not go to the site, however, said that this horse was definitely not hit by lightning. A forestry official who checked the area with a Geiger counter found high readings in the vicinity of the burns, but lower readings as he went away from them toward the horse. The reactions to the report and its sequels have been fairly typical. The University of Colorado, where Dr. Condon was conducting a $500,000 study of UFOs for the US Air Force, sent someone to take a look at what was left of Snippy, who had been dead for a month. "I find nothing unusual about the death of a horse," he said. In Ray Palmer's magazine, Flying Saucers, an American ufologist asked in anger, "He finds nothing unusual? Perhaps the razor-sharp clean incision around the horse's neck was the work of a mountain lion? The huge circular indentation and several smaller ones was that of a monstrously fat fine bird, with babies all suffering with radiation sickness and 4 legs?" And the newsletter published by a UFO investigation committee in Sydney, Australia, drew a most interesting parallel between the Snippy case and a more recent report from Canada. Terry Goodmurphy of North Livingstone, Ontario, aged 20, and his friend Stephen Griffin, 19, were driving west on Highway 17 about 9:30 p.m. on November 5, 1967, 2 months after Snippy's death. As they neared the top of the Maple Ridge Hill, they saw an orange glow in the sky and thought it was caused by a fire. They stopped to watch and saw it was moving. They drove on again for about 3/4 of a mile and then saw the object more clearly as it appeared to maneuver at an altitude about 100 feet. The two boys became frightened and turned around and notified the Ontario Provincial Police. Nothing was to be seen when the police investigated. However, that same evening, something happened at the Lorne Wilgenath farm in the nearby Sawberry. For on the following morning, when a standard-bred mare, Susie, and another horse usually came in from a pasture, only the second horse came to the barn, and a long cut was noticed on his neck. Susie was not there. It was only after several hours of searching that her owners found her lying dead with her throat and jugular vein cut. Perhaps I have now succeeded in evoking in the reader's mind a new awareness. The suggestion of a possible parallel between the rumors of today and the beliefs that were held by our ancestors, beliefs of stupendous fights with mysterious supermen, of rings where magic lingered, of dwarfish races hunting the land. Purposely, in the second chapter, I have limited the argument to the mere juxtaposition of modern and older beliefs. The faint suspicion of a giant mystery, much larger than our current preoccupation with life on other planets, much deeper than those housewives' reports of zigzagging lights. Perhaps we can resolve the points by trying to understand what these tales, these myths, these legends are doing to us. What images are they designed to convey? What hidden needs are they fulfilling? If this is a fabrication, why should it be so absurd? Are there precedents in history? Could imagination be a stronger force to shape the actions of men than its expression in dogmas, in political structures, in established churches, in armies? If so, could this force be used? Is it being used? Is there a science of deception at work here on a grand scale, or could the human mind generate its own phantoms in a formidable collective edification of worldwide mythologies? Is a natural force at work here? Man's imagination, like every known power, works by fixed laws. These words by Hartland, written in 1891, offer a clue. Yes, there is a deep undercurrent to be discovered and mapped behind these seemingly absurd stories. Emerging sections of the underlying pattern have been discovered and mapped in ages past by long-dead scholars. Today we have the unique opportunity to witness the reappearance of this current out in the open, colored naturally with our new human biases, our preoccupation with science undercourse, our longing for the promised land of other planets. A new mythology was needed to bridge the stupendous gap beyond the meaningless present. They provided it. But who are they? Real beings or the ghosts of our own ridiculous petty dreams? They spoke to us in smooth English. They did not speak to our scientists. They did not send sophisticated signals in uniquely decipherable codes, as alien beings are supposed to do if they read Walter Sullivan, as any alien being should before daring to penetrate our solar system. No, they picked Gary Wilcox instead, and Joe Simonton, and Maurice Massey. What did they say? That they were from Mars, that they were our neighbors, and above all, that they were superior to us, that we must obey them, that they were good. Go to Valençol and ask Massey. He will tell you perhaps how puzzled he was when suddenly, without warning, he felt inside himself a warm, comforting feeling. How good they were, our good neighbors. The good people. They took a great interest in the affairs of men, and they always, on the quotes, stood for justice and right. They could appear in different forms. With them, Joe Simonton exchanged food. So in times gone by, did Irishmen who talked to similar beings. In those days, too, they were called the good people, and in Scotland, the good neighbours, the sleek myth. What did they say then? We are far superior to you. We could cut off half the human race. It does all make sense. These were the facts we have missed, without which we could never piece the UFO jigsaw together. Priests and scholars left books about the legends of their time concerning these beings. These books had to be found, collected, and studied. They contained no solutions, only elements of great puzzlement. But this puzzlement was documented. Together, these stories presented a coherent picture of the appearance, the organization, and the methods of our strange visitors. The appearance was, does this surprise you? Exactly that of today's UFO pilots. The methods were the same. There was the sudden vision of brilliant houses on the course at night, houses that could often fly, that contained peculiar lamps, radiant lights that needed no fuel. The creatures could paralyze their witnesses and translate them through time. They hunted animals and took away people. Their organization had a name, the Secret Commonwealth. In The Magic Casement, a book edited by Alfred Noyes about 1910, I find this little poem by William Allingham, which I would like all ufologists to learn as a tribute to Joe Simonton. Up the airy mountains, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting, for fear of little men. Wee folk, good folk, trooping all over, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather. Down along the rocky shore, some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam. Some in the reeds of the black mountain lake, without frogs for their watchdogs, all night awake.